The Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing on marijuana laws in America, racial justice, and the need for reform. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. In 2017, there were over 600,000 marijuana-related arrests reported in the United States. Of these, almost 600,000 were arrests for marijuana possession in 1 year. Indeed, hundreds of thousands of people, the majority of whom are Black and Latino, have had their lives impacted by arrests and convictions for marijuana offenses. Since the time President Nixon declared a war on drugs in the early 1970s, the effect of this war on Black and Latino communities has been severely disproportionate. The war on drugs was racially biased from its inception, and it has been carried out in a discriminatory fashion with disastrous consequences for hundreds of thousands of people of color in their communities. Today, nearly 80% of people in federal prison and almost 60% of people in state prison for drug offenses are Black or Latino. A 2013 study by the American Civil Liberties Union found that on average, a Black person is 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though Blacks and whites use marijuana at similar rates. These racial disparities in marijuana possession arrests exist in all regions of the country, in counties large and small, urban and rural, wealthy and poor, and with large and small Black populations. In recent years as a society, we have begun to examine the issues surrounding the disproportionate impact of the war on drugs and to develop policies and legislation to work against the devastation wrought by this war in the Black and Latino communities. Part of the devastation have been that we criminalized a health problem. While it is not in the jurisdiction of this committee, I do want to register the fact that some people do become addicted to drugs, including marijuana. And while we poured millions of dollars into incarceration, we did not put adequate resources into drug treatment. And while legalization is the direction many states are going, we need to make sure that a percentage of the revenue targeted that's earned from commercialization will go toward needed treatment services. In 1996, California became the first state to decriminalize marijuana for medicinal purposes, and more states have followed. Today, the majority of states, 33, and the District of Columbia have decriminalized medical marijuana. Beginning with Colorado and Washington in 2012, 11 states, including most recently Illinois, have also begun legalized marijuana for adult recreational use. At the federal level, the criminal laws that pertain to marijuana are governed primarily by the Controlled Substances Act, or CSA as we often call it. The CSA was signed into law by President Nixon in 1971, and it established a scheduling system through which the federal government regulated the lawful production, possession, and distribution of controlled substances, including marijuana. Marijuana was initially placed and today remains on Schedule I. As a result, a person who grows, possesses, uses, sales, transports, or distributes marijuana, even if it's done in a way that is consistent with state law or authorized by a state license, is nonetheless in violation of the CSA and remains subject to federal prosecution. In addition, because marijuana is still a federally controlled substance, the application of various money laundering and banking laws leaves many marijuana dispensaries being totally cash-only business, which in some instances can be dangerous and vulnerable to robbery. During the Obama administration, the Department of Justice issued guidance that made clear that the federal government would not pursue legal challenges against jurisdictions that authorize marijuana so long as those states and local governments maintain strict regulatory and enforcement control on marijuana cultivation, distribution, sale, and possession, limiting the risk to public safety, public health, and other law enforcement interests. The Trump administration rescinded that guidance to federal prosecutors and encouraged them instead to charge and pursue the most serious, readily provable offense. There is, therefore, a growing interest for this subcommittee to examine the laws that regulate marijuana and how Congress should respond to the growing trend toward legalization. The collateral consequences of even an arrest for marijuana possession can be devastating, especially if a felony conviction results. Those arrested can be saddled with a criminal conviction that can make it difficult or impossible to vote, obtain educational loans, get a job, maintain a professional license, secure housing, secure government assistance, or even adopt a child. These exclusions create an often permanent second-class status for millions of Americans. Like drug war enforcement itself, these consequences fall disproportionately on people of color. Personally, I don't automatically believe that legalization will result in a decrease in the disproportionate arrest of people of color, in particular African Americans, but I do hope that those who use the disproportionate arrest as part of the campaign for legalization will be just as concerned and active if the disproportionate arrest rates continue years after legalization. There is a growing consensus in this country that current marijuana laws are not appropriate and we must consider reform. Today's hearing is a first step in that process. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses, and now I recognize the distinguished ranking member, who's serving as ranking member today,
Acting
right?
ranking member, I suppose.
Acting ranking member from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You know, marijuana decriminalization may be one of the very few issues upon which bipartisan agreement can still be reached in this session. It doesn't require endorsing cannabis, quite the contrary. I think there's clear evidence that marijuana can cause long-term neurological problems in children and adolescents, and no one should approach the use of any drug without caution and moderation. I believe we should do everything we can to prevent its use by children and warn of its use by adults. But it ought to be crystal clear to everyone that our laws have not accomplished their goals. In fact, a deputy sheriff once said that if he were to choose 2 high school students anywhere in the country at random, give them each a $20 bill, send one to buy pot and the other to buy booze, the child he sent out to buy pot would always be the first one back. They know where to get it, and the dealer's entire business is built on ignoring the law. The youth sent to buy alcohol would visit one liquor store after another, get carded, and get thrown out precisely because the dealer's entire business depends on obeying the law. I do worry about excessive use of marijuana by young adults, but excess is a trait of the young that is usually cured by experience. And against this, we need to balance how many millions of young people have had their lives ruined because of a marijuana conviction from their youth that follows them for the rest of their lives. Worse, like liquor prohibition in the 1920s and 30s, our marijuana laws have not only failed to curtail its use, they have created a violent underground economy and contributed to overall disdain for the rule of law in general. I mean, let's face it, radish growers don't kill one another over their territory. Furthermore, the essence of federalism is deferring to state legislatures on most domestic issues. Louis Brandeis famously observed that a state may, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. Many states are doing exactly that today, and the rest can learn from their example, for good or for ill. Last month, the House of Representatives approved a bipartisan amendment to protect state laws on marijuana commerce from interference by the federal government. I believe more permanent reforms are needed to allow individual states to control, regulate, and tax marijuana as each one sees fit. The present conflict between state and federal law in this matter is no longer sustainable, and it must be resolved. Personally, I believe cannabis use in most cases is ill-advised. But many things are ill-advised that should not be illegal, but rather be left to the informed judgment of free men and women. Bruce Hershenson, in discussing anti-tobacco laws, observed that for every pleasure in life, there is a concomitant risk. And usually, the greater the pleasure, the greater the risk. With enough force and regulation, he said, we can create a nearly risk-free society. But it will also be the most miserable, colorless, tedious, boring society ever imposed upon a people. I do regret that just as strong bipartisan consensus is emerging on this issue, the majority has decided to play the race card at today's hearing. We should have only one race in our free country, the American race. And the left does enormous harm every time it tries to divide Americans along racial lines. The fact is that our marijuana laws have badly served all of us as a nation, And this realization could be used to bring us together rather than to tear us apart. When laws have been tried over many years and have not only failed to achieve their objectives, but have created great harm in the process, I think it's time to revise or repeal them. I believe we have reached such a moment, and shame on those who would use it to inflame racial divisions. I yield back.
I now recognize the committee chair, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I read my prepared statement, I want to say two things. Number one, until his last paragraph, I was preparing to say that I have the pleasure of agreeing with every word that the distinguished member from California had said in all respects. Let me just add, though, that enforcement of marijuana laws has been done in a racially disparate manner. The effects have been racially disparate. To point that out and to seek to cure that is not to inflame racial divisions. It's simply to point out a fact of life and to try to cure it. I thank our crime subcommittee chair, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass, for holding this hearing today on the need to reform our marijuana laws. I have long believed that the criminalization of marijuana has been a mistake, and the racially disparate enforcement of marijuana laws has only compounded this mistake with serious consequences, particularly for minority communities. Marijuana is one of the oldest agricultural commodities not grown for food. It has been used medicinally all over the world since at least 2700 BC, but its criminalization is a relatively recent phenomenon. The use of marijuana, which most likely originated in Asia, later spread to Europe and made its way to the Americas when the Jamestown settlers brought it with them across the Atlantic. The cannabis plant has been widely grown in the United States and was used as a component in fabrics during the middle of the 19th century. During that time period, cannabis was also listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia as a treatment for a multitude of ailments, including muscle spasms, headaches, cramps, asthma, and diabetes. It was only in the early part of the 20th century that marijuana began to be criminalized, mainly because of misinformation and hysteria, based at least in part on racially biased stereotypes connecting marijuana use in minorities, particularly African Americans and Latinos. Unfortunately, the same racial animus motivating enactment of these laws also led to racially disproportionate enforcement of such laws, which has had a substantial negative impact on minority communities. The enforcement of the laws, I would also add, has also had a bad effect on non-minority communities. As our chair, Ms. Bass, pointed out, the collateral consequences of convictions for marijuana possession, and sometimes even for a mere arrest, can be devastating. For those saddled with a criminal conviction, it can be difficult or impossible to vote, to obtain education loans, to get a job, to maintain a professional license, to secure housing, to receive government assistance, or even to adopt a child. These exclusions create an often permanent second-class status for millions of Americans. This is unacceptable. It is also counterproductive, especially in light of the disproportionate impact that enforcement of marijuana laws has had on communities of color. It is not surprising, therefore, that over the past 2 decades, public support for legalizing marijuana has surged. States have led the way with reforms, and presently medicinal or recreational marijuana use is legal in 33 states and the District of Columbia. However, our federal laws have not kept pace with the obvious need for change. In my view, applying criminal penalties with their attendant collateral consequences for marijuana offenses is unjust and harmful to our society. The use of marijuana should be viewed instead as an issue of personal choice and public health. An examination of our marijuana laws and potential reforms is long overdue. I should add that one of my first votes that I cast as a freshman member of the State Assembly in New York in 1977 was to decriminalize marijuana in New York. I appreciate the chair for holding this important hearing today. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate that. And thanks for scheduling this hearing. You may recall some of my colleagues and I asked Chairman Nadler in April to promptly hold a hearing on legislative solutions to the conflict between federal and state marijuana laws, and to permit the committee to fully examine the issue. The scope of today's hearing is limited to the racial justice implication of marijuana laws, but many more factors must be explored before we change federal law and establish protections for states that legalize marijuana. As I wrote in April, the legal status of marijuana in the United States is in complete disarray. Over 30 states in the District of Columbia have legalized medicinal or recreational use of marijuana. More states have opted to decriminalize marijuana possession or legalize the consumption of extracts from the marijuana plant. Yet some states prohibit the use of marijuana completely. Marijuana remains a Schedule I under federal law, and the Federal Drug Administration has never concluded the valid medical and scientific evidence exists to support the prescribed use of smoking marijuana. However, the FDA has approved some of the marijuana's derivative compounds for prescription use and should do more. There are 3 primary international drug control treaties aimed at combating drug abuse. The United States is one of 186 states parties to these treaties, which seeks to combat drug trafficking and limit the manufacture, distribution, and sale of psychoactive drugs exclusively to medicinal and research purposes. Covered under these conventions include cocaine, heroin, marijuana, as well as opioids and other synthetic drugs. This committee must be mindful the conflict already exists between federal and state laws, and in drafting a solution, our treaty obligations must also be considered and evaluated for a long-term purpose. Since 2009, the Department of Justice has provided amended and withdrawn guidance over the years in the form of memoranda to 94 U.S. attorneys about how to prioritize enforcement of the cultivation, distribution, and sale of marijuana in light of the conflict between federal and state laws. I believe these changes in DOJ policy have added to the confusion. Earlier this year, Attorney General Barr agreed, stating the current situation is untenable and really has to be addressed. It's almost like a backdoor nullification of federal law. If we want a federal approach, if we want states to have their own laws, then let's get there right away. I agree. Federal and state laws, scientific evidence, international law, and a variety of enforcement policies have all combined to form an unsustainable state of affairs regarding marijuana. Numerous bills have been introduced over the years to address this situation. In April, I co-sponsored the STATES Act. This bipartisan bill would ensure that each state has the right to determine the best approach to marijuana within its borders. At the same time, the will of most of those states to limit or prohibit marijuana use must be respected. Regardless of how members may feel about the proper approach, I believe the committee and Congress must clarify the rights, responsibilities of individuals, physicians, businesses, medical patients, law enforcement officials relative to marijuana. That is what this committee is for. That is what this committee should take up, and that is why we are here, to find good solutions. The STATES Act, I believe, is an excellent foundation for legislative reforms and to begin in this committee or other committees. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's panel. The Honorable Ms. Marilyn Mosby has been the state's attorney for Baltimore City since 2015, during which time she has put in place a number of initiatives to reform the criminal justice system in Baltimore. In January of this year, Ms. Mosby instituted a policy to stop prosecuting the possession of marijuana and move to vacate marijuana possession convictions dating back to 2011. Dr. David Nathan is a psychiatrist, educator, and consultant. Dr. Nathan is an advocate for evidence-based changes in drug policy, focusing on principles of public health and social justice. He is the founder and board president of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. Mr. Neil Levine is a national advocate for the cannabis industry. He co-founded and serves as the CEO of the Cannabis Trade Federation, which is a national coalition of cannabis-related businesses representing various aspects of the industry. Dr. Malik Burnett is a physician, advocate, and entrepreneur. Dr. Burnett works on issues pertaining to drug policy reform, particularly relating to racial justice. He has worked on developing medical and adult use cannabis policy in the District of Columbia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Vermont. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. Please note that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table. When the light switches from green to yellow, you will have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes has expired. Before proceeding with testimony, I hereby remind each witness that all of your written and oral statements made to the subcommittee in connection with this hearing are subject to penalties of perjury pursuant to 18 U.S.C. 1001, which may result in the imposition of a fine or imprisonment of up to 5 years or both, as we talk about criminal justice reform. Honorable Marilyn Mosby.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Bass, Chairman Nadler, as well as Ranking Member Mr. McClintock. Did I say that right? Mr. McClintock, as well as, I believe Mr. Collins left, And the honorable members of the House Judiciary Subcommittee of Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, I'm honored to be before you today. As the chief prosecutor of a major American city, it is my sworn ethical obligation as an administrator of justice to not only ensure the safety of my community, but to seek to reform and improve the criminal justice system where justice requires. As was mentioned, on January 29th of this year, I announced that my office would stop devoting resources to the prosecution of marijuana possession charges, regardless of weight and criminal history. I mandated the referral of every first-time felony drug offender to my office's job training diversion program, and my office then moved to vacate the convictions of almost 5,000 marijuana possession convictions dating back to 2011. In tandem with this announcement, my office released a white paper that enumerated the lack of public safety value in the prosecution of marijuana possession, the counterproductive outcomes of utilizing limited law enforcement resources with little to no public safety value, and the racially disparate enforcement of marijuana laws resulting in adverse collateral consequences for poor Black and brown communities in Baltimore. The reason I'm here today is because there is no better illumination of this country's failed war on drugs than the city of Baltimore, Maryland. A mere 45 minutes away from our nation's capital, Baltimore, a city inextricably woven into the fabric of our country's history, a city so critically important to the founding of this nation, a proud city that boasts some of the greatest American legends, from Justice Thurgood Marshall to the birthplace of the Star-Spangled Banner. Unfortunately, last year, Baltimore led the nation in per capita homicides, rising opioid deaths, and is one of the most segregated and impoverished cities in the nation. For decades, the state of Maryland has criminalized substance use disorders as opposed to treating it as the public health crisis that we all recognize it to be. Meanwhile, over 20 million Americans have been arrested for violating marijuana laws that have imposed legal, social, and economic debilities and marginalization on every basic survival necessity of life for those not only convicted, but also those incarcerated. From housing, healthcare access, welfare, immigration, employment, property rights, mobility, education, financial aid, and even voting. Whole communities are being ravished and have lost generations of mothers, fathers, brothers, sons, and daughters to incarceration and a cyclical poverty due to these convictions. And what's worse is that data shows the enforcement of these laws are overwhelmingly inflicted upon poor and Black communities. It's been reported, as was already mentioned, Black people are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession in the United States than white people, despite individuals of both races using marijuana at the same rate. In the city of Baltimore, prior to the decriminalization of 10 grams or less, Black people were 6 times more likely to be arrested for simple possession. And while many had hoped that decriminalization would offer a respite to communities of color, the flagrant racial disparities continue to exist. In our nation's capital, Black people are 11 times more likely to be arrested for public consumption of marijuana than whites. In the city of Baltimore, my city, in 2017, 95% of all citations issued by the Baltimore police were issued to Black people. 42% of the citations issued citywide were issued in a single district that represents 9% of the total city population, which happens to be 95% Black and disproportionately impoverished. Which is why I'm here today for 3 critically important reasons. 1, because I refuse to accept the status quo any longer, especially when there's so much evidence that proves that we can be smarter and do better as it relates to marijuana policy. 2, I refuse to be complicit in the continued decimation of poor Black and brown communities, where we as a community irresponsibly continue to maintain and unfathomably seek to justify and defend a set of policies that without question are racist and discriminatory in implementation. And 3, because it is the right thing to do, which is why I applaud Chairwoman Bass for her leadership and her courage in convening today's hearing. I implore Congress today to not only decriminalize marijuana, but to remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, thereby federally legalizing it. Much like the regulation of alcohol and tobacco, let the states decide the legalization, regulation, and taxation of this substance, because by doing so diminishes the Black market distribution of it. Furthermore, it is completely illogical to impose federal interference or criminal penalties upon individuals that act in compliance with state law. This is especially pertinent to our immigrant population that already exists in a toxic and constant state of fear of deportation. For decades, Congress has provided federal economic incentives to states through grants and by way of task forces to encourage what we know was now a discriminatory enforcement of marijuana laws against Black and brown people. I implore Congress to now provide these same economic funding opportunities to encourage states to create mechanisms to right the wrongs of the past, reinvest and not just the individuals hampered by these inequitable convictions, but I also implore you to reinvest in the communities that have been most adversely impacted. You have the power to encourage the states to enact automatic and mass expungement and vacatur and post-conviction. We spend allocation of $4 billion federally every single year on marijuana enforcement. And I would encourage you all to please include creating and thinking about job opportunities, reentry, and mental health services for formerly incarcerated individuals, and the inclusion of people of color in a billion-dollar industry that was shut out, that is including and intentionally shutting them out.
Thank you. Dr. Nathan.
Thank you and good morning, Chairwoman Bass, Chairman Nadler, Congressman McClintock, and honorable members of the House Judiciary Committee. I speak to you today as the founder and board president of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, or DFCR. DFCR is the leading national physicians association dedicated to the legalization, taxation, and above all, the effective regulation of cannabis for adults. DFCR has hundreds of respected physicians members in nearly every U.S. state and territory. As physicians, we believe that cannabis should never have been made illegal for consenting adults. It is less harmful to adults than alcohol and tobacco, and the prohibition has done far more damage to our society than the adult use of cannabis itself. However, it is not harmless. People who are predisposed to psychotic disorder should avoid any cannabis use. Also, as with alcohol and other drugs, heavy cannabis use may adversely affect brain development in minors. But cannabis prohibition for adults does not prevent underage use nor limit its availability. For decades, preventive education has reduced the rates of alcohol and tobacco use by minors. At the same time, underage cannabis use rose steadily despite its prohibition. In the past several years, as more states legalize cannabis for adults, the rate of underage use has leveled off. Some have argued that if cannabis is legal for adults, then minors will think it's safe for them. But when cannabis is against the law for everyone, the government sends the message that it is dangerous for everyone. Teenagers know that's not true. By creating a legal distinction between use by adults and minors, we teach a respect for scientific evidence and the sanctity of the law. This may be why teen use has remained level or decreased in legalized states. Cannabis use can impair driving, as can most psychoactive drugs, including antidepressants, antipsychotics, sedatives, opioids, and even stimulants, especially among inexperienced users. But driving under the influence of cannabis and other drugs is already a criminal offense in every jurisdiction, including in legalized states. And in legalized states, studies show no adverse impact on traffic safety resulting from legalization. There is a persistent misconception that cannabis is a gateway drug. While users of hard drugs often try cannabis first, they're even more likely to try alcohol and tobacco. But not surprisingly, people generally try less dangerous drugs before trying more dangerous drugs. But the vast majority of those who try cannabis, alcohol, and tobacco never go on to use harder drugs. As we learned in high school, correlation does not imply causation. In 2019, even those who oppose legalization generally believe that cannabis should be decriminalized. But decriminalization is an inadequate substitute for legalization. In legalized states, government-licensed retailers scrupulously check IDs and only sell cannabis products to adults. But where it is merely decriminalized, the point of sale remains in the hands of drug dealers who sell cannabis, along with more dangerous drugs, to children. Where cannabis is only decriminalized, the government cannot regulate the production, testing, or labeling products, which means that users consume an untested and potentially adulterated product of unknown potency. According to the Controlled Substances Act, a Schedule I drug must meet 3 specific criteria: high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety. Cannabis does not meet any of these criteria, and that is why today most states and a majority of physicians recognize the therapeutic value and relative safety of cannabis as a medicine. But cannabis shouldn't simply be rescheduled. Like alcohol, it should be removed from the Controlled Substances Act completely. Even if it had no medical value, a free society should not punish competent adults for the personal use of this non-lethal plant. We must stop using a sledgehammer to kill a weed. Informed physicians may disagree about the specifics of good regulation, but we can no longer support a prohibition that has done so much damage to public health and personal liberty. Members of the House Judiciary Committee, please work with us to advance public health and protect our children through effective, evidence-based regulation of cannabis in the United States. My teenage children are growing up in a nation that does not regulate the cannabis industry. I want future generations of teenagers to grow up in an America that does. I thank you for your time.
Mr. Levin?
Chairwoman Bass, Mr. McClintock, Chairman Nadler, honorable members of the subcommittee, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Neil Levine, and I have been an advocate for the reform of cannabis laws for over 16 years. Today, I'm the CEO of the Cannabis Trade Federation, a national coalition of cannabis-related businesses dedicated to professionalizing, diversifying, and unifying the cannabis business community. Our members are some of the most successful and responsible operators in the United States cannabis market today, generating billions of dollars in sales while navigating and complying with regulations that are not only comprehensive in scope, but vary significantly from state to state. So it's my honor to testify at this historic hearing today, representing our industry. As an organization, CTF is dedicated to encouraging greater minority ownership and participation in the cannabis industry. In May of this year, we launched a groundbreaking task force centered on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the cannabis space. We are fortunate to have some of the most prominent civil rights leaders in the nation working with a diverse group of cannabis industry professionals, stakeholders, and the CTF board to develop and implement a strategy to diversify the cannabis industry. The state-based cannabis industry today is not only serving consumers, but has also become a driver of economic growth and tax revenue in states across the country. In Colorado, for example, sales of state legal cannabis have exceeded $6.5 billion since the first adult use sale in 2014, generating more than $1 billion in tax revenue and fees in Colorado alone. Nationally, the Marijuana Business Daily's annual fact book estimates that state legal cannabis sales will exceed $12 billion in 2019. Conservative estimates have roughly 200,000 full-time workers in state legal cannabis industry today. Despite all of this progress, there remains a troubling and frustrating dichotomy between the state and federal cannabis laws that produces a broad range of problems. Most notably, cannabis businesses struggle to obtain and maintain accounts with financial institutions due to the underlying activity being illegal under federal law. The level to which cannabis businesses must rely on cash transactions as a result poses a hazard to both cannabis industry workers and the general public. Because of this dichotomy, cannabis businesses are denied almost all standard business deductions, meaning we are essentially taxed on our revenue, not our profits. This saddles the industry with an effective federal tax rate of 70% or higher, pulling most of the profits out of the business. Most cannabis businesses, unable to invest profits back into the business, invest in our workers. The cannabis industry consistently offers living wage entry-level positions that require little to no formal education. But this gap between state and federal law also creates a tension for cannabis industry operators and employees who must show up to work every day knowing their activity could put them in danger of federal prosecution. Outside the threat of prosecution, our employees face a litany of issues in their daily lives, such as not being able to obtain mortgages, such as being denied car loans, sometimes having to be paid in cash and having their personal bank accounts shut down, and on and on and on. These are dedicated and passionate workers acting in strict compliance with state law, with the support of their state and local governments who have families, and they should not be forced to live under the constant threat of arrest and punishment by federal authorities for going to work. The great news is there are several pieces of legislation that would end federal cannabis prohibition and address these issues. And today, this subcommittee is now tackling the issue head-on. This is amazing progress, and CTF supports all positive cannabis reform legislation. But as industry, we are not only concerned with how the policy is shaped, but how it impacts our businesses, our employees, and our state and local economies. And while some members of Congress are having the debate of how we should end cannabis prohibition, there are still many members who are struggling with should we end cannabis prohibition, not how. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of American workers' daily lives continue to be impacted by this dichotomy between state and federal law, and the situation has become untenable. The most immediate path to resolving the state-federal conflict is the passage of the States Act, currently sponsored by 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee, including ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Collins of Georgia. The States Act would amend the Controlled Substances Act to exempt both individuals and businesses who are acting in compliance with state cannabis laws. We have a long way to go with respect to reversing the harms caused by cannabis prohibition, and we need to begin the process as soon as possible. The question before this subcommittee and before Congress is whether there is a willingness to advance a bill to the President's desk that will immediately address nearly all of the issues that I have raised. With strong bipartisan support for the States Act, it is possible during the current session of Congress to take major steps towards respecting state cannabis laws, protecting workers, advancing a more secure, vibrant, and equitable cannabis industry. We hope that Congress will take advantage of this opportunity, and I'd be honored to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Dr. Burnett.
Chairwoman Bass, Chairman Nadler, Ranking Member McClintock, members of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Malik Burnett. I'm a physician by training and currently serve as the Chief Operating Officer of Tribe Companies, a minority-owned multi-state cannabis company with operations in California, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. Over the past 7 years, I've provided testimony to many state and local legislatures on the regulatory aspects of medical cannabis and cannabis for adult use, but it is with great pleasure that I come before you today not to talk about whether ending cannabis prohibition at the federal level is a good public policy, but to discuss the best ways to go about ending cannabis prohibition and restoring communities devastated by the war on drugs. It is an unmitigated fact that the state of cannabis policy today is best described as a tale of two Americas. In one America, there are men and women, most of them wealthy, white, and well-connected, who are starting cannabis companies, creating jobs, amassing significant personal wealth, and generating billions in tax dollars for states which sanction cannabis programs. In the other America, there are men and women, most of them poor people of color, who are arrested for cannabis and suffer the collateral consequences associated with criminal conviction. 659,000 Americans were subject to this reality in 2017, 91% of those for merely possessing the plant. We have to do better. The status quo is not sustainable. Drug policy in America is and has always been a policy based on racial and social control. From the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937 with its race-based motivations to the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill legalizing commercial hemp cultivation and production, the laws and policies created in this legislative body have the power to shape the social determinants of health of every American. With this in mind, you'll hear arguments today that suggest when it comes to cannabis policy, this legislative body should take an incremental approach and do what is most politically expedient. This argument is not only intellectually lazy, but it is blind to both the historical and ongoing harms associated with current policy, and will ensure that the vast majority of economic gains associated with this new industry go to a select few. It is an effective whitewashing of cannabis history in America. Congress should instead take an intentional approach to cannabis policy reform with the concept of restorative justice as the guiding principle. This body should look to states like California, Massachusetts, and most recently Illinois for policies that utilize tax revenue generated from the sale of cannabis to promote community reinvestment, including programs for record sealing, expungement, job training, the financing of public schools, parks, and recreational infrastructure, and medical and public health research. Focusing legislative efforts to create incentives which ensure that the economic potential of this industry is shared across communities and that the employment bases are comprised of a diverse set of workers is a worthwhile goal and well within reach at the federal level. Examples like the Marijuana Justice Act and the Respect Resolution provide a solid framework upon which more progress can be made. In addition to more effectively utilizing tax revenue to restore harmed communities, Congress can take steps towards making the banking environment more friendly for small business development within the industry by removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. While most discussions on cannabis and banking rightfully revolve around the public safety issues associated with dealing in cash, a lack of banking access also plays a determinative factor in who can participate in the industry. Without small business lending, all cannabis companies must rely on angel investors, family offices, and high-interest debt financing vehicles in order to get the needed capital to start a business. The vast majority of this capital does not come from diverse sources and is a significant contributing factor to the lack of diversity in the industry. By removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, Congress would support the expansion of commercial banking access could target small business administration lending programs to promote diversity within the industry and across the country. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the immigration challenges associated with continued cannabis prohibition at the federal level. America is fundamentally a nation of immigrants. However, the status quo prevents immigrants from working within the cannabis industry, as having a job in this space makes them and every non-citizen in their family inadmissible for naturalization. Furthermore, legal permanent residents who use cannabis medically or recreationally can be indefinitely detained and deported when attempting to return to the United States after traveling abroad. The damage associated with breaking up immigrant families has been on full display in America as of late. Congress should not allow the legal use of cannabis or efforts to acquire gainful employment in the legal cannabis industry to contribute to this fundamentally un-American activity. Overall, it is important that Congress make a concerted effort to provide legislative solutions to close both the economic and enforcement divides which exist in cannabis policy in America today. A successful legislative effort removes cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act and takes a comprehensive approach to addressing both the banking and taxation issues, as well as the criminal justice and economic issues involved, leaving no one behind. Much has been made for the need of reparations in recent political times, and in the context of cannabis, the convenient argument of the Senate Majority Leader that none of us are currently living or responsible goes out the window. All lawmakers are currently living have a responsibility to right the wrongs associated with cannabis prohibition.
Thank you. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a written testimony from Dr. Sabat, who is with the Smart Approaches to Marijuana, an organization that raises concerns over resources for drug treatment and also questions the disproportionate arrest rate going down with legalization. So I ask unanimous consent. Without objection, I'll enter it into the record. I'd like to ask Ms. Mosley, when you were talking about Maryland, you mentioned the disproportionate arrest rate I think you were talking about in Washington, D.C. And I wanted to know if you could help me understand why you think that the disproportionate arrest rate of African Americans continues to be 4 times as high, even though marijuana is legalized for recreational use in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. One of the issues that I see and I foresee is that even with the decriminalization, I think that we have to go beyond decriminalization of marijuana. We have to actually legalize this drug. And the reason why, among many, including the fact that there should be a regulation that will allow the states to control it and a safe environment for our children, but more importantly, it's what we've seen just with the mere decriminalization of marijuana is the discriminatory enforcement still exists.
But I thought in D.C., and I might be wrong, that it is legal. It is legal for recreational use.
Well,
and I wanted to know if you knew about the arrest rates in California and Colorado, where it is legal for recreational use.
Recreational use in D.C., yes, it is. What I cited was that even with the legalization of it in D.C., what is happening is that these individuals are still being targeted 11 times. African Americans are being targeted 11 times more than white people for public consumption and being arrested for that.
So why is that? I mean, legalization was supposed to address that.
Chairwoman Bass, can I jump in here? I ran the
Yes, go
campaign
ahead.
to legalize cannabis in D.C., and so the interesting dichotomy that exists in the district is that, the Congress governs all of the funding provisions for the local government in D.C., and so we haven't actually been able to set up a regulated market. And so what you have in D.C. is it is legal to possess cannabis. However, there's no means through which you can actually acquire cannabis, and so
What
lots
about
of
California and Colorado?
in California and Colorado, you actually, the reality of the situation is that there's biased enforcement in criminal justice writ large, right? And so cannabis is the entryway in a large number of ways to the criminal justice system. And when you look at the overall number of arrests that are occurring within any state, if you end up legalizing cannabis, you significantly drop the total number of arrests. But in all honesty, biased enforcement of the law is a reality that exists
okay.
beyond cannabis.
Okay, so in Maryland, what is the legal age that you can use marijuana?
So it's not based on legal age. It has not been it's been decriminalized for possession of 10 grams or less.
Okay.
So there is no legal age. And essentially what has happened is that even with that decriminalization portion of it, it's now given to the police officers can issue civil citations. What we're finding is that even in the implementation of these civil citations, they're only targeting certain demographics in particular areas,
Right.
which I've
Right.
already cited.
Yes, thank you. You know, one of the issues in California and actually in the states where marijuana is legal is driving under the influence and how you measure it. Since marijuana is stored in fat and, you know, it can be detected after 30 days. I think, Dr. Burnett, have you done some research about how to detect whether or not you are intoxicated?
So
while
I
driving.
haven't done research myself, but the research that is out there right now is still in a preliminary level. One of the main reasons for that is because of the federal prohibition that prevents us from being able to conduct research more intentionally on the effects of operating motor vehicles under influence of cannabis. However, what I would say
Do you
is
know
that
about, maybe because of the federal prohibition here, do you know anything about Canada?
In
If any-
Canada?
If
Yes.
any places have been able to come up with,
So
ways to
interestingly,
determine.
Canada just ended up legalizing at the federal level in October of last year.
okay.
And so we're still very much at the preliminary stages. There are some preliminary studies and devices out in the marketplace that look at impairment while driving under the influence, but as I believe my colleague, Dr. Nathan said, you know, when you actually go about the business of legalizing cannabis in any state, it is still illegal to operate a vehicle under the influence.
yes,
And
yes.
so,
Dr. Nathan, you wanted to respond?
Absolutely, sure, and thank you. I live in New Jersey, and New Jersey is the state that is proud to have the second largest number of drug recognition experts, or DREs, that are specifically trained to detect impairment of any kind in drivers. And that is right now the state of the art. There is no good per se test. There's no sample of blood or saliva or breath that will give us a clear image of whether somebody has recently used cannabis, let alone is intoxicated, and that is even farther from being able to say that somebody is impaired. So right now, it's really drug recognition experts that are the way to go, and we really should support that in every jurisdiction.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. McClintock. Oh, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Just real quick, the last 2 minutes of this conversation is probably the one that needs to be focused on the greatest, in addition to changing, as I've said before, but I appreciate that conversation. With that, I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Getz, a member of the full committee, be permitted to sit in during this subcommittee during this hearing.
Without objection.
Without objection, I yield him my time.
I thank the ranking member for yielding me his time. I had the privilege to write Florida's first two medical marijuana laws along with my colleague, Mr. Stubbe from Florida. And I really wanted to start with the States Act because it seems to me that that would give states like Florida and others who've implemented a regime not just of decriminalization, but that facilitates providing medical cannabis to patients in need a way to do so. Among our panel, who supports the States Act? Would you just raise your hand? And then who opposes the States Act? Okay, two of you? Is that right? Dr. Barrett, did you oppose the States Act?
I don't oppose the States Act. I think that we should do much more than what goes on in the
If
States
it was
Act.
up for a vote, would you vote for it or would you vote against it?
I would vote for it to make progress.
Great. Well, that's great to hear because I was a little concerned in your testimony. You seem to indict incrementalism a great deal. And in my state, it was that incrementalism that led to progress because if we kind of operate from our various political poles on the issue, nothing really gets done. And when we initially legalized non-euphoric cannabis, and then we're able to go back and legalize euphoric cannabis, and then we were able to go back and provide minority access for licenses to grow cannabis. It took those multiple steps, and I'm wondering why that's so concerning to you.
Thank you for the question. I would say that if you actually went about the business of passing the States Act, you would actually create inherently more confusion inside of the marketplace than you would clarity. Right now, just as an example for banking, right? There's actually very little problem with banks providing service to cannabis businesses given the FinCEN guidelines that have been provided before, but banks are reluctant to do so because at the federal level, cannabis remains on the Controlled Substances Act. Through the States Act, that would still be true. There are provisions that provide some level of clarity for that, but it doesn't necessarily provide a wholesale solution for solving the problem. And so we're
I
just
sense
ultimately
Mr.
creating
Levine
more.
is seeking an opportunity to respond to that. Do you
Sure.
hold
Thank
that
you,
view?
Congressman. Yeah, the American Bankers Association and Credit Unions Association have all endorsed the States Act and said that this would address banking. As somebody who's representing the industry, I can tell you that the States Act is clarity that we absolutely need to operate because of our tax issues, because of our banking issues, because while we agree with the overarching goal, absolutely, to get to the full end of prohibition, we can't lose sight of the fact that we have over 200,000 Americans working in the industry today that are having all of these incredibly negative impacts on themselves and their families. And so while we have something that can actually specifically address this now and help the industry get through some of these issues to resolve the conflict between federal and state law, that does not end the conversation about what prohibition, the end of prohibition looks like. I think what we're seeing...
Would you respond specifically to the assertion that the States Act would make things more confusing?
No, I think it would actually clarify it and would focus the conversation here, because I've had a lot of conversation with members of Congress and their staff, and there's a good chunk of the Congress that still isn't sure that we should legalize cannabis at all. It's not a debate about how we should do it. So, but there is a growing agreement that the conflict between...
I only have about 90 seconds left, and I fear that is, for all of us here gathered, to move cannabis reform forward, and I'm so grateful for the majority for scheduling this hearing and making this a priority. My deep concern is that concerns over how far to go on some of the restorative elements of our policy could divide our movement. And as you've pointed out, it's already a divided Congress on this question. Though America is not divided, though America largely supports cannabis reform, Congress doesn't reflect the will of America. And so if we further divide out the movement, then I fear that we'll continue to fall victim to that which has plagued other Congresses where we won't get anything done. And Madam Chair, I know you'll take great leadership in this, and so I want to take my remaining few seconds to point out a few areas of restorative justice just as categories that we might look to. Initially, license requirements for historically disadvantaged groups. We created minority licenses in the state of Florida to ensure that the industry better reflected the citizenry. Second, what you've heard the witnesses mention regarding plowing some of the resources generated from the industry back into the communities that have been most ravaged by the war on drugs. But I would also highlight a third category. One of the major problems the industry has is that they're unable to take normal tax deductions. And if we were to fuse our goals on inmate reentry with restoring those tax benefits, potentially cannabis companies could earn the ability to take normal tax deductions if they hired people that were engaged in that reentry process.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nadler?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Nathan, what advantages does cannabis have as compared to opioids as a treatment for chronic pain?
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, and that's a great question. First, I should note that my father has very kindly given me permission to talk about the fact that he, too, is somebody who is using cannabis both for Parkinson's disease and for chronic pain that is a familial problem. And he has essentially discontinued his use of opioids. Now, I understand that's just a single example, but we don't need to go just by anecdote. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in 2017 released a comprehensive report, really a book, that's available for free online, and I encourage people to go and look for it, because it outlines exactly how it is that cannabis can serve as an alternative to opioids. It also really outlines the health effects, both positive and negative, of cannabis generally. There are really two things, I would say, that make cannabis a good alternative to opioids. One is the lowered potential for dependence and addiction, which is also related to a decreased level of tolerance. Opioids generally stop working in chronic use. Cannabis does not seem to have that same level of tolerance and decrease in efficacy. So that's one advantage. The other advantage is that cannabis has fewer side effects and is non-lethal in overdose. To me, that's potentially the most important fact, because even where opioids are prescribed properly, we still see overdose rates that contribute to what was last year over 70,000 Americans dying from opioids.
So in summary to this, cannabis is not, cannot be fatal in an overdose.
That's correct. There are
Unlike
no documented
opioids.
cases.
And are you saying it's non-addictive, you don't get the dependency?
No, there is dependency for cannabis, but it's far less than it is for opioids, for tobacco, for alcohol. The rate of dependence in adults is about 9%, which is similar to the rate of dependence of Americans on caffeine.
Okay. Can you, well, it may be crazy, but it may be true.
Not maligning the coffee industry either.
Can you explain how removing marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act would benefit medical research on cannabis?
Absolutely. See, right now, in theory, it is possible to do research on cannabis with a Schedule I status with special permission from the DEA and if there's sign-off from the National Institutes for Drug Abuse and FDA. But as it stands, cannabis research simply cannot be done. One of the honorary board members of our organization has been trying for years to do cannabis research. She has been granted a Schedule I license to do research, but when she's able to get cannabis, it's generally of very inferior quality, and the amount of THC is much closer to that of industrial hemp than it is to the kind of cannabis that's being used commonly today. And so only by descheduling cannabis can you enable the research both legally and also in terms of a patient's willingness to be honest with their physician about their use of cannabis when you decrease the stigma of its use by taking it off the CSA.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, can you explain whether or not the communities that have been harmed the most by decades of disproportionate marijuana enforcement have obtained their fair share of the benefits of marijuana legalization in the states that have legalized it?
I would maintain that nobody's maintained their fair share due to our taxation and the challenges that the industry faces. But no, I think that in our inception, as an industry, that the first adult use sales occurred in the beginning of January of 2014, that from the owner and the board level, we are not a very diverse industry to start.
Thank you. And finally, if Congress ends federal marijuana prohibition without including provisions to help disadvantaged entrepreneurs, who will benefit the most? Small businesses who are more likely to have ties to the local economy, or large businesses that are already the most advantaged to dominate the marketplace?
Well, we think that cannabis should be removed from the CSA entirely and agree with that point. But in regards to the States Act, we believe that it should be removed from the Controlled Substances Act entirely, and we agree with that point. In regards to the States Act, it would actually benefit small business owners. The large business owners can amortize and run at very thin margins across multiple states, where small business owners under 280E, without any cogs to pack their costs back into, can't make any money, so they're all in jeopardy.
And that would be true if Congress ends federal marijuana prohibition, or does the States Act, either one?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My time has expired. Oh, Madam Chair?
Yes.
I'd like unanimous consent to enter the statement by the Statement of Principles on Federal Marijuana Reform by the Marijuana Justice Coalition to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Mr. McClintock?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Levine, I mentioned Louis Brandeis' approach, states being laboratories. They experiment, we can all benefit from the results of the experiment. Could you briefly summarize the good and the bad that a state like Colorado has discovered as they've legalized marijuana?
Yes. Well, the sky has not fallen. We have seen in Colorado, per the question Chairwoman Bass was asking before, that arrest rates have fallen in Colorado since legalization, about 50% for African Americans, 50% overall. But
we keep hearing youth usage is up, traffic accidents are up.
teen usage is down. There is no statistical that to my knowledge, there's nothing that shows in a statistically viable way that there's been any change in traffic accidents.
What I had heard was that traffic accidents involving marijuana have gone up, but at the same time, traffic accidents involving alcohol have gone down, and the fatality rate has gone down because people who are driving under the influence of marijuana apparently tend to drive a little slower.
Well, not to get too wonky about it, but alcohol is water soluble and cannabis is fat soluble, so it stays in your system for up to 30 days, and they weren't testing for it before. So the state of Colorado, CDOT, started actually testing for cannabis after legalization. So while you see an increase in the number, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's been an increase in people driving impaired. There might be an increase in people using cannabis because it's legal, but use does not mean impairment.
And you say that youth usage is actually down.
Teen usage
Okay.
is down.
And that's because the dealers are now carding them?
It's a factor. It's a number of factors. You have to be 21 years of age or older to enter any of our establishments. There's multiple identification checks. Your entire license is on the line if you sell or divert cannabis to a minor. So regulation works better than prohibition, and we're seeing these impacts. But part of the issue is where you've got states that have full prohibition that border a state that doesn't have prohibition, you're running into some of these issues. So we do agree that cannabis should be removed from the Controlled Substance Act entirely, but in the interim, we have some real-world issues.
That is my next question, because one of the things we hear from states that have prohibition is we're seeing all this marijuana coming in from the bordering state that is where it's legalized, and that's causing problems in our states. What role do you see in the federal government involved in interstate commerce between states where it's legalized and states where it's still prohibited?
So, to your earlier point, Congressman, the people have spoken. We have 33 states, plus the District of Columbia, plus multiple territories that have opted out of prohibition in some form, 11 plus the District of Columbia, and 2 territories that opted out entirely.
Do you dispute the prerogative of a state if its voters would like to keep it prohibited, states should be allowed to keep it prohibited?
Because of the inertia of Congress on cannabis policy reform, what we've seen here is the states have led because the people of the states have said that they want to do this. So, and a lot of that have been in ballot initiative states. And I think in a lot of these border states, if you take a look at the polling, that the vast majority of Americans want to see cannabis prohibition end. So I honestly think it's a little bit of a situation of maybe the people being ahead of their elected officials. But yes, I believe that this is an issue.
But if a state legislature elected by the people decides to keep it prohibited, do you have any problem with that?
This is
As a policy issue, they may be making a mistake, but do you dispute their right to make that mistake?
We support their right to opt out of prohibition until the federal government acts, for sure.
All right. One concern I have is on the overtaxation of marijuana. It's looked upon in some sectors of government as a tremendous cash cow. I mean, the profit margins are huge. Well, the reason the profit margins are huge is because our laws have terribly constricted competition. As competition enters the marketplace, you're going to see those profit margins drop dramatically. My concern is looking at the industry as a cash cow and applying all sorts of exorbitant taxes upon it is the same effect as prohibition. It will drive what should be legal commerce back into a violent underground economy. Are you concerned about that?
Very concerned about that. Our main competition are the criminal markets right now. And so these state-based laws, what they're doing is we're taking commerce out of the criminal markets and putting them to regulated and taxed markets. So the more tax, the higher the tax, the more restriction, the more regulation you place on that, the products that you ban from that, you're ceding those products to the criminal markets. So regulation works better than prohibition, and we would like to see regulation nationwide. In the interim, we would like to see the federal government stop interfering with the state laws.
Great. Thank you very much.
Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for your presence here today. And as I was delayed, I managed to hear some of the discussion delayed in the Homeland Security Committee, but I'm very interested in the work that has been done by State's Attorney in Baltimore City. We're certainly trying to work in the state of Texas without having the marijuana laws removed from the controlled substance, but trying to on a county by county to be more reflective of dealing with simple possession by way of misdemeanor and/or citation. So let me hear again, if I could, and I know that you have given it in your testimony. You've heard some of the commentary about the idea that taxation may shove some of the market into the underground, but let me hear directly from you on the issue of mass incarceration and what you have seen in your utilization of restorative justice. And might I thank you for your leadership and your work.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would just say that, unfortunately, as a prosecutor in the city of Baltimore, it's incumbent on me to not just look at the laws and consider safety, but to understand that in the administration of justice, I have to pursue those wrongs and right those wrongs of the past, right? And so what we've been able to see in Baltimore is that there's been discriminatory enforcement in the application of marijuana laws. And what I've done in utilizing my discretion as a prosecutor, in light of the fact that the legislature is considering the decriminalization, legalization of marijuana and have not yet acted, is that because of this discriminatory enforcement, because there is no public safety value, because it's counterproductive to the limited resources that we have, is to utilize my discretion to say we're not prosecuting possession of marijuana cases in the city of Baltimore. And the reason why is because of those reasons, right? And so what we've seen, unfortunately, is because of that discriminatory sort of enforcement, it has eroded public trust.
What has been the impact of your changes?
So what I can say is that, the number of marijuana possession cases do not at this appear. I made the announcement in January, right? But the police department did not agree with my decision initially. And I can say that looking at the numbers, they have decreased the number of possession of arrests that they're making. I've made it very clear that, as the state's attorney, I can never be complicit in discriminatory enforcement of laws against poor, discriminatory enforcement of laws against poor Black and brown people.
It would help your work if this was removed federally from the Controlled Substance.
It would absolutely help my work because it would encourage the states to act. As I stated, this is something that they're considering that they have not yet done. And the other thing that I think is also incredibly important, and one that I would like to highlight, just with the states—
My time is short.
I apologize. I apologize.
You want to just do 2 seconds and finish your sentence?
Is the need to reinvest into those individuals in those communities that have been disproportionately impacted. The States Act does not do that, and that is one of the reasons why I'm opposed to it. We attempted to vacate—
We need new legislation that would reflect that concept of being able to be part of restorative justice.
Absolutely.
Dr. Burnett, and then I want to ask Dr. Nathan, if I might. Dr. Burnett, can you talk about the value of having a community that has been the raw material for mass incarceration, move to a level of economic empowerment, but also restorative justice? Because we're still looking at, I don't know if someone has had a misdemeanor on marijuana and then they want to go into a business. Right. I think that's something that we have to look at. And then Dr. Nathan, again, I think it is important. You made an important point about tobacco. But your question for me would be, the impact on children. You decriminalize it, it's off the controlled substance, is a greater access, and I'd be interested in that. So I have a short period of time.
Sure.
You would answer, really, and then Dr. Nathan.
Really quickly, it is important that, as we go about reforming cannabis laws, that we actually ensure that the people who were historically criminalized have an opportunity to now participate in the economic opportunity. They can start local businesses in their local communities. In all honesty, that's what they were doing before because they were shut out from being able to participate in the normal economy. And so being able to do that now with this new market is important.
Thank you, Dr. Nathan. And I would say that if you had a misdemeanor offense, that you should not be barred from,
Absolutely.
From being able to participate. Dr. Nathan.
Thank you, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. You're asking about increased access for potential underage users. I certainly share that concern. I have an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old, and in the 10 years that I've been working on this issue, advocating, I have myself been very concerned about it. And of course, my concern is not just a personal one, but a professional one, and reputationally. you know, I was holding my breath to see what was happening in the legalized states. And what we are seeing seems to reflect decreased access. And this is actually the conclusion that was drawn in an article that just came out in JAMA Pediatrics, an esteemed journal, where they are looking at medical and recreational legalization. And what they are seeing is that to a degree, medical, and especially in recreationally legal states, adult use states, that underage access appears to be going down, and that's reflected in decreasing numbers of underage users, especially in the youngest and most vulnerable age range of 12 to 17 years old.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stubbe?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Gates and I were very involved in the legislation in Florida. I was in the State House and the State Senate and dealt with it in both chambers. And here are the two main challenges that Florida faces as it relates to, we have medicinal marijuana through a ballot initiative. I filed a bill in the House so that the legislature would have control over it because I thought that that was the best place statutorily that we could modify it and change it as we saw challenges with businesses and so on and so forth. But that never passed, and so there was a ballot initiative. So now people in Florida have a constitutional right to medicinal marijuana, which I think causes other challenges from the legal spectrum. But here's the two challenges from a practicality standpoint that we face in Florida right now. Number one is those that have and I can't say a prescription, but a recommendation for medicinal marijuana in Florida and working at, say, an air conditioning company or working heavy machinery or working on things that are dangerous implements or driving. The challenges as has been stated, is you can't test if the individual is under the influence at the time because marijuana stays in your body for 30 days. That's the challenges that small businesses in Florida are facing right now. So I'd ask Mr. Levin if there's a way, if there's some work that we can do as it relates to that, and then I'll get to my second issue that's facing Florida.
So the question was specifically about people being barred from.
Well, they're not barred because they have a medicinal use for it. The challenge is I've got, and I'll give you a exact example. Just in the district a couple weeks ago, I have an individual who's a friend of mine who owns an air conditioning company. So he obviously has a number of employees who are driving around his vehicles every day who may have a recommendation for medicinal marijuana, but may also be under the influence of marijuana at the time that they're operating his vehicles that he's liable for.
Right.
Those are the challenges that we face in Florida. And I supported the bill. I support people being able to use it for medicinal purposes in Florida, but that's the challenge from a practicality standpoint that we face. Is there a way that we as a state or a country can try to address that specific issue for those that own small businesses that are hiring these individuals who may be under the influence while they're working?
Yeah, so no one should drive impaired under any controlled substance, and we certainly don't support that. And when it comes to cannabis, use doesn't mean impairment, so you can detect it in your body. So as an employer, nobody should be driving a vehicle or using any critical piece of equipment while they're impaired. And we need, as was said earlier, we need better testing. There is no per se test that currently exists to actually show impairment and not look at metabolites, because marijuana can stay in your system for up to a month, but actually look at levels of impairment.
Okay. The other big issue that we face in Florida is obviously something that's also been illustrated as it relates to the banking industry and the federal laws as it relates to, you know, having all of this money and all this going back and forth through the process. I know that the States Act and the discussion that Representative Gates and I just had doesn't address the quote-unquote decriminalization or the move from Schedule 1 to, say, a Schedule 3. Would you support moving marijuana from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3, and would that solve the problem that banks such in Florida are facing as it relates to medicinal marijuana?
It wouldn't solve banking, it would solve our 280E tax issue. We're in favor of cannabis being removed from the Controlled Substance Act entirely, but the States Act does for state licensed businesses, their employees, their consumers, that all of that is removed from the Controlled Substance Act in the state system. If you are not violating state law, you would no longer be violating federal law. It just pulls the federal government out.
And I would support that moving from a Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I would encourage any of my colleagues that are interested on this issue. I know there was a bill filed last Congress. There doesn't appear to be one filed now. I'd love to work with any of those on the other side of the aisle to move that issue forward. And if you guys support that, I'd be happy to work with you on that moving forward. That's all the questions that I had. I yield the balance of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank each of you for being here today with your expertise, sharing that with us. As you may know, Georgia has taken measured and bipartisan approach and with respect to marijuana. In 2015, then Governor Nathan Deal signed a law allowing those with certain medical needs to possess cannabis oil. But legal access was still difficult since buying, selling, and transporting cannabis oil remained illegal until just a few months ago. In April of this year, the legislature passed a law that will finally ensure a legal supply of cannabis oil for patients seeking to alleviate the effects of cancer, Parkinson's disease, and seizures. However, even these modest bipartisan efforts are at odds with federal law that still imposes steep penalties, even for the low THC cannabis oil legalized in Georgia. With respect to criminal justice reform, Georgia has a similar pattern. Governor Deal led bipartisan efforts to reduce recidivism and keep nonviolent individuals out of the criminal justice system. Government Deal's bipartisan reforms are saving Georgia taxpayers millions of dollars, and it's also just the right thing to do. A major piece of these reforms are drug courts that find a better resolution to nonviolent marijuana offenses. Collectively, these reforms have begun to reduce the racial inequality in Georgia's criminal justice system. But here again, harsh federal penalties for marijuana possession stand in sharp contrast from Georgia's efforts to do what is right for the people of Georgia, even when there is a bipartisan consensus. Dr. Nathan, my question, I actually have two questions for you. How would federal marijuana decriminalization enable doctors to better help patients in states like Georgia that allow cannabis for medical treatment?
In the answer to that question, and thank you, Congresswoman McBath, what you're alluding to is actually quite noteworthy, which is that the federal government really needs to decriminalize. It doesn't itself need to legalize it. That's for the states. But to take it off of the Controlled Substances Act is to expand by orders of magnitude patient access to cannabis, and it also has the effect of reducing stigma to individuals who want to use it. It enables research. It enables honest discussions between doctors and patients about their cannabis use and their potential misuse of it. And it also puts it on a more level playing field with much more dangerous drugs for which it can act as a good substitute for medical use.
Thank you. And my second question will be, while Georgia has actually recognized the medical benefits of marijuana for certain patients, there are still concerns about the unintended consequences. A recent peer-reviewed study showed that in states with medical cannabis laws saw an increase in the cases or number of cases of opiate abuse, addiction, and overdose deaths. Can you address that concern for us?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a recent article that you're referring to that came out that in its conclusion was saying that it contradicted earlier findings that showed an actual decrease in use. But that study actually was much more inclusive of the definition of what a medically legalized state is. And what you were talking about earlier is important, that it's not enough to legalize medical cannabis or cannabis oil or CBD. The benefits of cannabis legalization only occur in the states where they've actually implemented the program and where people can access it legally, because it can be legal at the state level, and if there's no legal access, then patients really aren't seeing the benefit. So where you see the rate of opioid use go down, and that is a 25% decrease in opioid overdoses, which can save tens of thousands of lives every year, that's only in states that have legal dispensaries. The study that you're referring to counted states that don't have a rolled out program for medical cannabis yet, that have just nominally legalized, and states for which only CBD is legal, and that, of course, is not the same thing as full spectrum cannabis oil.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Mosby, I have one question for you. How can federal decriminalization of marijuana empower states to pursue criminal justice reforms that save money and align with local values?
So I would say that right now, when we look at what we're spending just in the enforcement of marijuana laws federally, it's about $4 billion, right? If we were to actually utilize the incentive, the financial economic incentives that we use in the creation of these task forces that we once put into play that were enforcing these discriminatory laws. If we were to implement those resources and to utilize those resources for community investment, some of the things that we can do just in righting the wrongs of the past is to ensure that states are following or encouraging states to, or incentivizing states to implement mass expungement, re-entry services for formerly incarcerated individuals. There are a number of harm reduction strategies and models that we can employ that would create incentives for states to follow the federal sort of rule and to provide and get the funding from the federal government.
Thank you. Mr. Klein?
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing. In Virginia, we have had similar circumstances as was shown in Georgia, and took action similar to what we've seen in Georgia. So I appreciate the gentlelady's comments. Studies have shown that cannabinoids have therapeutic effects in treating conditions such as chronic pain, nausea, as well as symptoms from conditions such as multiple sclerosis and HIV/AIDS. As a former member of the Virginia House of Delegates, I introduced legislation to allow physicians to recommend cannabinoid oil to their patients, to create legal dispensaries, and to create an affirmative defense to possession of cannabinoid oil for medicinal use. This non-hallucinogenic derivative can be given in drop form to help people suffering from a variety of debilitating medical conditions. And as we've witnessed the opioid crisis ravage rural America, I believe it's important to find alternatives for addictive painkillers, and I was surprised to hear of this study and do think it is counter to what we've seen from a lot of different studies related to the use of cannabinoids as a replacement for opiates. As states have made changes to their own marijuana laws, conflicting policies from various administrations has placed a burden on law enforcement and states as they implement reforms. Congress must find a solution to alleviate the conflicts between state and federal marijuana laws, and it's important to evaluate the role that the federal government should play when it comes to the regulation of marijuana. The STATES Act is a promising step forward in giving states flexibility in addressing many of these issues, and furthermore, I'm interested in reviewing ways to reclassify marijuana to a more appropriate classification on the federal drug schedule. In the meantime, however, we have Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, and in light of that, I would ask Mr. Levine, how do you reconcile the actions of states like Colorado with Article 6?
Well, the only preemption action I'm aware of didn't go through in the courts, which was the state of Arizona, I believe. And obviously, through the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, the powers are not derived specifically to the federal government or reserved for the states. We now have 33 states plus the District of Columbia, and multiple territories have opted out of prohibition in some form. And these systems, outside of the conflict that we have with federal and state law—
Does the federal law give the states the right to opt out?
That power, the power to prohibit cannabis is not enumerated in the Constitution.
But it is a federal law.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Article 6 clarifies that federal law is superior to state law.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So your proposal then is to remove the federal law completely.
The States Act would amend the Controlled Substance Act to say that if you are in compliance with state law, you would not be in violation of federal law.
Right. So you support the States Act, but you also support going further and removing it from classification altogether.
Yes, so we support Congress removing cannabis from the Controlled Substance Act entirely.
Okay. Mr. Nathan, there's evidence legalization of marijuana has led to increased unintended exposure among young children. by 2011, rates of poison center calls for accidental pediatric marijuana ingestion has more than tripled in states that decriminalized marijuana before 2005. Have you seen youth access to marijuana increase as a result of legalization efforts? I know Mr. Levin did mention teen rate is down. What about rates of accidental ingestion among children?
A great question, and thank you, Congressman Klein. Because you're illustrating that there are two different issues here. One is the intentional use by teens and maybe older children, and then the unintentional ingestion, not just by children, but also, you've heard, by pets. And indeed, those numbers have gone up in legalized states. Now, you have to remember that, first of all, that cannabis is not a drug that is lethal in overdose. So as scary and as unpleasant as an accidental ingestion may be, it is nothing compared to the countless household chemicals and other medications that kids can take that would indeed cause death. I believe that all households that have any dangerous substances that can be contained should be contained in a drug safe. And then I think you'll see a benefit. But also consider that in the legalized states, you actually have the ability to regulate the packaging to ensure that the packaging is more child resistant. What you don't see that in other states. And there's actually a key factor that, well, two things. One is that the rate of accidental ingestion, though it has gone up quite a bit, is still a very small number compared to the ingestion of other chemicals and other drugs. And there's data to support that. And the other point is that with the legal status of cannabis changing, families are much more comfortable bringing their young child or their pet to get some kind of help if there has been an accidental ingestion, because there's no longer the fear of the criminalization and the stigma of them having had the drug in the household at the first place. So in a sense, that's a good thing, that families would feel comfortable bringing their children to the emergency room in a legalized state.
Mr. Deutsch?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like, first of all, to ask unanimous consent to enter for the record a statement from Randall Meyer, Executive Director of the Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce, entitled Racial Justice in Cannabis Prohibition and the Federal Role in the New Global Cannabis Economy. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. A report by the ACLU entitled The War on Marijuana in Black and White provides a startling statistic. Between 2001 and 2010, there were more than 8 million arrests involving marijuana. In 2010, there was one marijuana arrest every 37 seconds at a cost of about $3.5 billion to enforce our marijuana laws. Between 2012 and 2013, more than 13,000 people were deported for possessing marijuana, and a black person is 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person. The damage caused by the enforcement of these laws, especially to minority communities, families, and individuals, is real. The collateral impacts of criminal record are devastating for an individual. Having a past arrest record involving marijuana can prevent a person from finding a job, finding housing, and being eligible for a loan. 2 years ago, in my state of Florida, 71% of voters supported the legalization of medical marijuana. Since being legalized, more than 200,000 patients have signed up to be eligible to use medical marijuana. But implementing the legalization of medical marijuana in Florida to ensure that people have access to the industry has been difficult. The growing, processing, and distribution of medical marijuana has been limited to a few companies in Florida. In fact, as of the end of April, 5 licensed companies operated over 82% of the state's dispensaries. Expanding that number, the number of licensed companies, and changing the status of marijuana at the federal level could assist in diversifying participation in this developing industry. The production, the processing, selling of marijuana is still illegal at the federal level, which creates significant limitations for businesses seeking capital to begin and maintain their operations, as well as expand their business in states where it is legal. Banks are not permitted to extend loans to marijuana businesses. The SBA is not available to provide support. Instead, marijuana business must rely upon capital investments from venture capitalists, private asset managers, or personal funds And because of the disproportionately small number of minorities who work as venture capitalists and private asset managers, it limits the ability for people to participate in the legal business opportunities that exist. Dr. Burnett, let me ask you, as more states legalize marijuana for recreational and medicinal use and the industry expands, what can be done to encourage diversity in the industry's production, processing, and selling?
Thank you, Mr. George. That was very much in line with my comments around expanding capital. Just to answer your question directly, when states go about the process of setting up legal regulated markets, by and large, the trend has been to place a cap on the total number of available licenses within any particular state, automatically creating a very competitive environment for the acquisition of those licenses. What we can do at a very base level is expand the number of total licenses available in any particular state, and then, if there's a concern about making sure that there are qualified actors, raise the regulatory requirements for you to be able to have that license. If we actually go about the business of removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, as you rightly point out, there'll be significantly more opportunities for the financing of traditional commercial loans or small business administration loans that can support greater diversity across the market and ultimately expand the number of opportunities available.
Great, thank you very much. Another critical issue that I think the committee should consider, Madam Chair, is the impact of marijuana legalization laws on American Indian tribes. Tribal nations are located within sovereign boundaries. They must still comply with federal laws, and under a 2014 DOJ memo, tribes were permitted to regulate the growing and selling of cannabis production on their land. But the memo was repealed by Attorney General Sessions, and as we've seen in states that have legalized marijuana, the revenue generated from the production, processing, and selling of marijuana could provide a tremendous benefit for tribal nations desperate for economic support. And so I would just ask if any of the witnesses could speak to how tribal nations could be brought into the discussion of benefiting from legalization of marijuana.
You want to do it?
Happy to jump in here.
Please, Dr.
Within the current context of the federal prohibition, there's a sizable number of tribes that are kind of sitting on the bench. And just as a writ large comment, here you as the Congress get to set the example to say, hey, if we take this cannabis out the Controlled Substances Act, we are explicitly stating that it is okay for tribes or for any other parties to be able to get in to the industry without fear of any sort of treaty violations or encroachment upon their rights as tribes. Generally, when you see tribes getting in or considering it, they automatically become concerned about, well, is the federal government going to come in and violate our sovereignty? Right? And so by removing the cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, you will immediately eliminate that concern and allow more tribes to be able to participate in the economic activity there.
Thanks, Dr. Burnett. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Mr. Jeffries?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the distinguished witnesses for your presence, your advocacy, and your testimony here today. Dr. Burnett, the origins of federal marijuana prohibition date back to the 1930s, is that right?
That's correct.
And it started with the Stamp Act?
The Marijuana Tax Act. Well, the Stamp Act preceded, but the Marijuana Tax Act was when it really jumped in.
Okay. And am I correct that that was driven by Harry Anslinger, who at the time, I guess, was the head of the U.S. Treasury's Department of Federal Bureau of Narcotics? Is that right?
That's correct.
And if you look at Dr. Anslinger's history, he seemed to have made claims about cannabis that were incorrect and that also targeted African Americans and Latinos as miscreants and the primary users of the drug. Is that right?
That is correct.
And I believe he said, quote, there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Is that correct?
That is correct.
He also stated, quote, their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
He also said, quote, this marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes entertainers, and others. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And this is the individual who drove marijuana prohibition that we're living with today. Is that right?
That is right.
So would it be fair to say, and I know you've done a lot of work on this, that the origins of federal marijuana prohibition are racially tinged, flawed, and stained with sort of the inhumane perspectives of the founding fathers of prohibition?
The foundations of marijuana policy are inherently racist.
Okay, no, thank you. Ms. Mosby, to sort of bring it into the modern context, the failed war on drugs began in 1971, is that right?
Yes. With
And that was
President
when
Nixon.
Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one?
Yes.
And when you look at the Controlled Substances Act that I believe was enacted in 1970, that sort of is the foundation for the modern structure of federal law with respect to drugs and substance abuse. Is that right?
That's correct.
And under that statute, marijuana is a Schedule I substance, the most restrictive category. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that means it has the same classification as heroin and LSD, and in fact, a higher schedule than cocaine, meth, and fentanyl. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I believe that there was a commission at the time that recommended against classifying marijuana as a Schedule I drug, finding that the drug had no links to criminal behavior and recommended that cannabis be decriminalized nationwide. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that recommendation was obviously ignored. Is that correct?
It was.
Now, Richard Nixon ignored that recommendation. I believe at the time, subsequently, one of his top advisors was John Ehrlichman. Is that true?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the fact that Ehrlichman has recently, or in his latter years, admitted that the war on drugs was created specifically to target Black Americans?
That is correct.
In terms of how mass incarceration has devastated families, individuals, communities, having gone from a place where there were less than 100,000 people incarcerated about 50 years ago to more than 2.3 million. You've been a prosecutor who's promoted public safety, but done it in a strong and an ethical way, anchored in social and economic justice. Could you just give us a perspective on why decriminalization of marijuana or taking a different approach is in the best interest of both public safety and social, economic, and racial justice?
So it's in the best interest of racial justice, because racial justice is a systemic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in the equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. And what we've seen through the enforcement of this war on drugs is that it has been a war on Black and brown people. And it's specifically the discriminatory enforcement against poor Black and brown people. And so from the perspective of criminal justice, we've criminalized what should have been a public health issue all of this time. And in light of the fact that these collateral consequences have had negative impacts, not just on the individuals, but on the communities that these individuals come from. These debilitating social, political, economic debilities are something that have not just marginalized the individual, but have marginalized communities. And I see this each and every day as a prosecutor in one of the most impoverished cities in the nation.
Well, thank you for your leadership. The war on drugs has been a failure. It's been a stain on our society, our democracy, our country. It's time to end it. We can begin by dealing with marijuana decriminalization. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Cicilline is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Chairwoman Bass and Ranking Member Radcliffe for holding today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your very helpful testimony. As you all know, according to the Department of Justice, nearly 600,000 people are arrested for marijuana possession each year. However, it's also estimated that even though both white and Black men and women use marijuana at roughly the same rate, African Americans are 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana offenses than white Americans. This disparity in the enforcement of drug laws, I believe, is among the most critical issues that needs to be addressed in our reform efforts. This is further complicated by the fact that while marijuana is currently listed as a Schedule I drug at the federal level, 11 states in the District of Columbia have legalized recreational marijuana use in some form, while 22 other states have legalized marijuana use for medicinal purposes. And while there might be some disagreement about how marijuana should be treated or regulated, it's of course unacceptable that marijuana laws are not enforced with the full equality that they should be, and that both the origins of the marijuana laws, as just described by my colleague, Mr. Jeffries, and their current application are disproportionately impacting communities of color, particularly poor communities of color. We have a responsibility to do something about it. So, Ms. Mosby, I first want to ask you just to speak briefly about some of the collateral consequences of marijuana convictions, because I was a former criminal defense attorney, and there were many young people who had a marijuana conviction that had implications for the rest of their lives in terms of employment, military service, a number of other eligibility for programs. So if you could speak to that for a moment so that people understand the gravity of this.
Thank you, Congressman. What I would say is the collateral consequences, as stated before, are the legal, social, and economic debilities that are imposed as a result of a criminal conviction or even an arrest. Regardless of that conviction, these individuals are known to have adverse sort of restrictions, and that goes and extends to adoptions, housing, health care access, welfare, immigration, employment, professional licensure, property rights, mobility, education, voting rights. A collective effect of these debilities marginalizes, as I stated earlier, the individuals, and it also extinguishes a level of hope and a positive pathway forward where it often, in times, increases recidivism and undermines meaningful reentry of that convicted individual for a lifetime. This not only affects the individual, but affects the communities. And even without, and I said this earlier, even without the conviction, the collateral consequences are still seen in the untold stigma that the disruption and humiliation, the unimaginable financial burden that is imposed on posting bail and hiring a lawyer, and even the lost hours at work or school. It's definitely something that is a problem.
Dr. Nathan, you look like you wanted to, thank you.
Yes, and this gives us an opportunity to really tie together the ideas of criminal justice reform, social justice, and public health. Because, you know, people have asked me, what's a nice guy like you doing here, a doctor who's really interested in public health? Well, to me, the criminalization of cannabis has been a far greater detriment to public health than it has been a benefit. And that is because for all the reasons the state's attorney Mosby was just listing, the cannabis prohibition perpetuates the impoverishment of the impoverished. And that economic impoverishment, we know, is a major impediment to access to health care. And that being the case, that makes cannabis prohibition a truly negative public health issue, even if you set aside the actual harms of the drug itself.
And for all the witnesses, is there any evidence in the states that have either decriminalized or legalized recreational use that there has been any significant increase in adolescent use of cannabis?
Just the opposite, Congressman. There's a new study out that Dr. Nathan
Everyone
referenced.
agrees with that?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Finally, Ms. Mosby, you talked about your opposition to the STATES Act because of the omission of some restorative justice component. I'm wondering if you would share with us what you think is the most effective way for us to think about those issues in terms of how do we ensure that the communities that have suffered the most because of our really obnoxious marijuana laws and have suffered disparate treatment as a consequence, that they might benefit from the economic value of a marijuana or cannabis operation, or there are other ways to compensate directly individuals who have suffered the consequences of this marijuana policy.
Thank you for your question, Congressman. I believe the federal government must create financial incentives to right the wrongs of the past and address the racial injustice that exists between and because of the criminalization and mass incarceration of poor Black and brown people. And by that, I mean that the federal government pretty much endorsed and encouraged through the criminalization of what should have been a public health crisis, that war on drugs, and Congress funded task forces in funding the grant programs to use discriminatory, what we now know was discriminatory discriminatory enforcement of these laws on poor Black and brown people. And what I think that the federal government needs to now do is to resolve these failed policies and then create financial incentives for the creation of automatic or mass expungement, because this is an issue that even we're plagued with and has come up in the state of Maryland and other states, vacatur, post-conviction relief, or resentencing opportunities for those already convicted. That's an individual, but the federal government also needs to extend resources to communities that have been most impacted by the discriminatory enforcement and collateral consequences of this enforcement. So we have to create financial reinvestment incentives that will create job opportunities for folks, increase reentry services for formerly incarcerated, advance harm reduction models in substance abuse disorder in line with public health. There's law enforcement assisted diversion. We can create incentives for states to adopt these policies and these models, develop community centers capable of educational support and wraparound services to some of our at-risk youth. And last but certainly not least, it's incredibly important, as we've already talked about, increasing the equitable access and inclusion of people of color in a billion-dollar industry that has attempted to shut out people of color. And Congress has that ability and that control, which is one of the reasons why I do not support the States Act, which, in my opinion, does not lend to that sort of investment in the community.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Liu is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to start off by thanking the witnesses for being here today. When I was in the California State Legislature, I worked to decriminalize marijuana, and I was one of the ballot guide authors for their successful ballot initiative that eventually decriminalized marijuana in California. I want to touch on what my colleague, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, said about the Controlled Substances Act and drill down into that some more. So Dr. Nathan, in your testimony, you stated that cannabis should have never been made illegal for consenting adults. It is less harmful to adults than alcohol and tobacco, and the prohibition has done far more damage to our society than adult use of cannabis itself. So I agree with that. Are alcohol and tobacco within the Controlled Substances Act as regulated?
I'm sorry, are alcohol and tobacco?
In the Controlled Substances Act.
They are not.
Okay, even though it is the generally accepted view that those substances are more dangerous than marijuana, correct?
Correct on both counts.
So the Controlled Substances Act has different schedules, and Schedule 1 is deemed to be the most harmful and potential to abuse. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, and marijuana is in Schedule 1, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, and it's along with other drugs such as heroin and LSD, correct?
That's right.
And your view is marijuana would also be less dangerous than either heroin or LSD, correct?
Correct.
All right. Schedule 2 is deemed to be less dangerous than Schedule 1. And some of those drugs include cocaine and fentanyl. Would you agree that marijuana is less dangerous than either cocaine or fentanyl?
I agree with that.
Right. So what we have here is this completely irrational system where drugs are more dangerous, like alcohol and tobacco, are not even in the act. And then drugs like heroin and LSD, which are far more dangerous, are in the same section as marijuana. And then you've got Schedule 2, which has cocaine and fentanyl, which is classified as less dangerous than marijuana. The whole system, to me, seems irrational. So I think marijuana should be taken completely out of the Controlled Substances Act. One of my colleagues on the Republican had said earlier today that he would support moving marijuana to Schedule 3. So, Mr. Levin, what would that do if it moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3?
It would open up research and it would solve our tax problem, which is specific to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, but it wouldn't open up banking and it wouldn't do a lot of the other things that folks are talking about.
And if it was simply moved to Schedule 3, it would actually still not be authorized for consenting adults.
Correct.
Okay. In terms of the banking issue, right now it's largely an all-cash industry, is that right?
We are able to get some sort of commercial banking services through credit unions or community banks mostly, but it's hodgepodge and it's dicey at all times.
Would you say the majority of businesses are banked, or the majority are not?
So the FinCEN guidance talks about establishing a relationship with the entity that you're banking with. So what we see in new emerging markets like California and states that just opened up more recently, those are almost all cash businesses. And as the businesses exist for a couple of years, they could eventually get some sort of commercial banking services, but we can't get loans, we can't do anything outside of get electronic deposits and payments.
And for a business that has trouble accessing banks, if they are relying on large amounts of cash, that poses certain elements that makes it riskier for that business in terms of just safety, correct?
Yes, sir.
It also would make it easier to avoid taxes, isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let me ask sort of this one last question, and I'll ask it of Ms. Mosby. Thank you for your great work on it. Even if we were to remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, states could still criminalize if they so choose to, right? Because states have vast discretion in criminal law matters.
They would still have the ability to legalize, tax, and regulate, or make a determination about the criminalization of marijuana.
Thank you. So my view is that it is a huge waste of federal resources to criminalize marijuana. Our patriotic and outstanding FBI agents and prosecutors should be working on taking down child sex trafficking rings. They should be working on preventing interference from foreign agents in our elections. They should be rooting out corruption in Washington, D.C. They should not be investigating and prosecuting marijuana crimes. And let me just end with this. My view is that everything in politics seems impossible until it happens. So 15 years ago, I would tell you, hey, in 15 years, we would have gay marriage in 50 states, and in some of those states, we'd be smoking weed. You think I was crazy. But that is, in fact, what is happening now. So I appreciate the fight. Keep on fighting, and I believe we can get this done. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Dean, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for your testimony today. I'm pleased that this subcommittee chose to have this hearing. I wanted to start with a couple of quick questions, but Dr. Nathan in particular, I was looking at your testimony, and this is the thing we hear all the time. And I'll quote you, there is a persistent misconception that cannabis is a gateway drug. Could you speak to that misconception? Help me speak to that misconception.
Absolutely. This comes up time and time again in the debate over cannabis. You know, this is one of the most thoroughly debunked issues in this debate. And the reason is that although there is indeed a correlation between cannabis use and the use of other drugs, there's also a stronger correlation between alcohol and tobacco use and the use of other drugs. And correlation does not equal causation. Just because the wind is blowing faster when windmills are turning faster doesn't mean that the windmills are creating the wind. And so you do see this sort of reverse directionality of causality. What we do know, and this does to some measure satisfy some of the observations that are made about cannabis and the use of other drugs, alcohol and tobacco, and the use of soft drugs and the use of hard drugs, and that is this common liability theory. And that is that there are a common set of factors that tend to lead to all drug use, soft drugs and hard drugs. And those factors are things like poverty, absence of parents in the home, not having dinner together at home, school failure, unsafe streets. And if you notice, a lot of these things are actually potential and real consequences of the drug war itself. So that there are many ways in which the prohibition of drugs generally is contributory to young people starting on a path that leads to drug use of all kinds, and certainly not simply cannabis.
And so beyond environment, also we know that substance abuse disorder has a genetic component as well. So thank you for helping me there, which leads me to Ms. Mosby. You talked about the impact that criminalization of marijuana has had on you, your work directly, your communities directly. Can you describe maybe if the world turned around and we actually recognized it is a public health issue, not a crime issue, what impact, what would your community, what would your work look like? What would law enforcement's work look like? What would your communities look like?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. What would my work look like if we were to focus on safety? It would be great, right? If we were able to utilize our resources towards violent crime. In Baltimore City in 2017, we had 343 homicides with a year-end clearance rate of 31%. Last year, we had 309 homicides with a year-end clearance rate of 26%. So what I would like to do as the prosecutor of a city, and one of the most violent cities in the country, is to focus my resources on solving those homicides and utilizing my prosecutors to work with the police. You know, after I came out with my policy to say that we were not going to be forcing marijuana possession laws, I worked with the police department. And I can tell you that, you know, from the numbers, what we've seen, and I'm not attributing this necessarily to my marijuana policy, but, you know, the non-fatal shootings and non-fatal shootings have actually, the clearance rate has gone up this year. The overall crime numbers have gone down this year. However, the homicides and non-fatal shootings are up. So what I would like to utilize and what I would like to do to utilize my resources is to focus on violent crime. And that's what we should be doing, punishing those that have committed the most heinous offenses against those that are the most vulnerable within our society.
And that is one of the most important public health crises in our country, the slaughter by gun violence.
Absolutely.
It's stunning, so I agree with you. The resources ought to be directed there. And there's an economic connection there that we should so obviously make. And maybe if I could end very briefly, I'd like to go back to the sad roots of our marijuana policy. If you could just tell us a little bit more about the racist roots of our marijuana policy.
Absolutely. If you look at the way the entire act, the Marijuana Tax Act, was socialized in Congress, initially it didn't have congressional support, but it was, you know, largely around the characterization and selling of the racist implications of the act that you were able to get enough support to impose a tax on cannabis. Cannabis was in the United States pharmacopoeia. It was widely used as a elixir for, I mean, William Osler, the father of medicine, said it was one of the best cures for the common headache. But once we started, criminalizing black and brown people, in order to be able to gin up the number of votes, particularly amongst the Southern legislative body at the time, we were able to impose the Marijuana Tax Act, and from there, the criminalization, has manifested over and over and gotten particularly pernicious.
Thank you. I see my time is up. Thank you all.
Yep.
Thank you, Ms. Dean, for saying your time is up. That's a rare congressional capability. Ms. Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having such an important hearing. I represent Florida's 26th district. It's a majority-minority community. About close to 60% of the people living in my community are Hispanic, 12 to 13% African Americans, and I can tell you that I see how Dr. Burnett, you mentioned in your testimony so eloquently that we have a tale of two Americas. In Florida, they legalized medical cannabis, and that industry has been mainly managed and dominated by white, wealthy Americans, yet marijuana is still considered, holding marijuana is still considered a crime, and it disproportionately affects communities of color, specifically in my community, and we need to break the cycle. I want to start with Dr. Nathan. Can you explain to us and to everyone listening today how incarceration of having possession of marijuana is a public health concern? Can you make that link for us, please?
Absolutely. First, I'll note that a lot of people say that, well, you don't get incarcerated for cannabis possession, which on the face of it sounds like a true statement. But when you look at the details, what you find is, particularly in communities of color, individuals who are arrested for cannabis and don't have the means to either get their record expunged or to necessarily pay the fines that are needed, they themselves can wind up in prison, and it all starts with an arrest for cannabis. Prison itself is, of course, one of the most unhealthy environments for any person to live in. And America has over 2 million prisoners, greater than the number of incarcerated individuals of any country in the world, including totalitarian countries. And so, of course, prison itself is a terrible experience for an individual to undergo, both in terms of physical health and also in terms of mental health. And what we find is that the United States penal system is the largest provider of mental health care in the world. And that statistic itself should tell you a lot about what incarceration does to the individuals who are incarcerated, and it doesn't even tell the story of what it does to the families of the individuals who are incarcerated, who themselves suffer economically. And that economic suffering all around leads, of course, to the limitations of access to health care. And in a country like ours, where it really is an expensive endeavor to get health care, it will limit an individual's longevity.
Interesting. So let me ask you, do you have any data on how much this is costing us to keep this population, which is about 60% of the people that are incarcerated are minority populations? How much is this costing America? How much can we save and invest in other programs like access to primary health care to our communities?
How many billions is it? I'm not sure. I could certainly get you that data. Jeffrey Myron, who is an economist at Harvard, was one of the individuals who was influential for me in understanding the harm of cannabis prohibition, because he outlined how much the drug war actually costs and how much legalization might save. So, of course, legalization is not a panacea, and of course, cannabis itself is no panacea in medical use. But it is such an improvement and such a relief to a society that has been plagued by the failed war on drugs for decades.
Thank you. And Dr. Burnett, what do you think we need to do at the federal government to ensure that ownership is equitable as we start legalizing medical cannabis across the state, especially in Florida? How do we ensure that we have equal opportunities for minority populations?
One, I think that, by simply going about the business of removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, as I said before, you send a message to a large swath of people within the country that, this is not a stigmatized plant. It's okay to get into the business of participating in the cannabis industry. Secondarily, at the federal level, largely there are lots of incentives for economic empowerment zones, tax credits, small business administration lending that can lower the barriers to entry for getting into and starting a cannabis business, which are significant, largely because of the fact that right now there are no means through which you can go about financing the startup capital necessary to get into your business other than by going to angel investors, hedge funds, venture capitalists, and the like, whom in and of themselves have a diversity problem. And so if we're looking to ensure that the economic gains are spread across the country, and this is something that is, the benefits are felt equitably, then the federal government can, take the first step by sending the signal that this is not a stigmatized activity, and then supporting that with economic resources and tax relief to ensure that in the places where harm has been most carried out, that benefits can be received.
Thank you so much. I have no more time. Oh,
Thank you so much.
can we allow the honorable ones? Okay, sorry.
We're going to get this over with. This is Fried Chicken Day, and that's an important thing. Firstly, without objection, I would like to introduce the testimony of Aaron Smith, Executive Director, National Cannabis Industry Association, into the record. Without objection, so done. Thank you. Been affected and minorities. I proposed for years, I think since my first year in Congress, the Fresh Start Act, and I've introduced it again. It would say that if you had a non-violent offense and you had gone 7 years without any other offenses in the federal system, you could get your record expunged. Hopefully we'll have a chance to get that done. Tell me your perspective on expungement of records and how that can affect people's lives.
So I would love to tell you, I actually, in filing the motions to vacate over 5,000 convictions, the actual court actually denied our request. We do not have automatic expungement for marijuana possession cases in the state of Maryland, but what we do have is, it's unfortunately, I deem this a second-class sort of remedy to righting the wrongs of the past. I think the number one priority would be a vacatur, and the difference between a vacatur and an expungement is that a vacatur is where you set aside a conviction, where the expungement merely seeks to remove the conviction from public view. And so what we're essentially saying is that these, based upon these discriminatory enforcement, these judgments should have been set aside. But there are hurdles to that. Without sort of federal enforcement or incentives to encourage the states to create these automatic expungements, in Maryland, there's a 4-year waiting period, right? People are suffering from collateral consequences not 4 years from now as a result of a marijuana conviction, or not even 7 years, but actually now in the current present day.
And some of those consequences, they can't get jobs because they've had a,
Exactly.
and they can't get maybe housing and federal programs.
The collateral consequences
loans.
extend to federal loans, it extends to housing, it extends to adoptions, it extends to the access of health care. These collateral consequences extend to employment, professional licenses. Every sort of basic necessity of life.
These restrictions, disabilities are all as a result of Harry Anslinger back in 1939, which was a stupid, foolhardy, racist, race-based policy that J. Edgar Hoover endorsed and has been the public policy of the United States since, and then politically was continued in 1971 with Ehrlichman's decision on the Southern Strategy, right?
It is.
So it's insane. This week I'll be introducing the Safer Streets Act, which would provide high crime areas, and Baltimore would be one, Memphis would be another, unfortunately, more opportunity to get more monies. And how could, if we had such a program, what would you suggest communities could use for better policing efforts in reallocating the priorities?
So, again, I think that is huge. I think that the introduction of that could be major for a city like Baltimore, but it would encourage us to utilize our resources not for marijuana possession, but for those violent offenses. It also can better community police relations, because what the discriminatory enforcement has pretty much resulted in is an erosion of trust among communities and the law enforcement police department that are there to serve them.
Dr. Nathan, I've sponsored a bill called CARES, which I think Cory Booker is my Senate sponsor. It's the Compassionate Access, Research Expansion, and Respect States Act of 2019. This current administration hasn't been as good as they've talked. The past administration wasn't as good as they talked either. Why do you think that we haven't had more efforts to get research on marijuana in basically our whole history?
It has been through no lack of effort on the part of researchers, particularly in recent history. You'd like to think that we're in an age where we at least are willing to ask the questions that need to be answered. Now, we have had quite a bit of research on cannabis over the years that has been allowed as it needs to be by the National Institute of Drug Abuse. But that research is almost exclusively on the harms of cannabis. So when we hear that we really don't know the harms of cannabis, that's simply not the case.
Doesn't cannabis, you said it's not a gateway drug. Does not cannabis cause people to try more than chocolate and vanilla at Baskin-Robbins?
It's debatable, actually. The literature's mixed on that question. So.
Let me ask Ms. Mosby this question. In jurisdictions where marijuana businesses can't use banks, does that contribute to other crime? Are the people in the marijuana business potentially subject to robberies or burglaries or other things because they're using cannabis?
It absolutely is, because knowing that, the criminals nowadays are very sophisticated, right? And understanding that there are these discrepancies and these conflicts between state and federal laws, the dispensaries are actually targeted. And we have seen some of those cases where individuals have been robbed.
Thank you. And my last question, and my time's up too, but there's nobody here except Mr. McClintock to object, and he's kind enough not to.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Overruled. Mr. Is it Levine or Levin?
Levine.
Mr. Levine, how does the banking policies, if you explain why incrementally amending marijuana policy under the Controlled Substance Act, as the States Act proposed, is more beneficial than just totally ending marijuana prohibition outright?
Well, I don't think we view it as incremental as that we're representing 200,000 workers in the industry today, that we need it as vital. But that's not in opposition to removing cannabis from the Controlled Substance Act entirely, which we fully support. Our position is that we have real-world issues today that this piece of legislation would fix. And to take, I appreciate that State Attorney Mosby said that it was her opinion that there was absolutely no equity provisions of States Act. A lot of this stuff is happening on the state level. 99% of all expungements have to happen at the state and local level. And we have, Illinois just passed a law, 25% of all revenue set aside for Restore, Reinvest, and Renew programs. Also, social equity applicants have lower application fees. In Massachusetts, where they've done equity applicants, not a single one has opened their doors because of lack of access to equity. And the head of Boston's chief of economic development said that the conflict between federal and state law is an obstacle to the local equity program. So we don't view this as competitive pieces of legislation. We would like to see it all passed as fast as we can get it passed.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your testimony. I appreciate all the witnesses today. This has been an historic hearing. I don't think the Judiciary Committee has had a hearing on marijuana. And so I thank Chairwoman Bass for scheduling the hearing. I thank her for allowing me to close it. I've been working on this issue for 40 years, and it's just crazy that we don't just get it all done. I appreciate Mr. Gates's work on the issue, and I understand incremental, but after 40 years, it's time to just zap straight up, get it all done, Schedule 1 gone. So thank you for this historic hearing. Thank all of our witnesses for appearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit written questions for the witnesses and additional materials. And with that and without objection, this hearing is adjourned. Pop.